Good evening, everyone. Good to see you all in the Lord's house tonight. I did have a kind of passing thought, maybe we wouldn't be very busy on Easter Sunday evening. Maybe we should just not have an evening service and cancel it this year. And, probably not that many people in. Good job I didn't, eh? So God is good in that respect. So I want to speak for a little while this evening just about Easter. It's without doubt one of the high points of the Christian calendar. This is the time of year that we celebrate the sacrificial death of Jesus and his resurrection from the grave on the third day. It's the central dogma of the Christian faith, as it is the Lord's death as our substitute that paid the penalty of our sin, and it's his resurrection from the grave that conquered death and opened the way for us to follow him into glory. Easter is the time that we celebrate God's work that achieved for us what we could not accomplish on our own. But not everyone believes that the events recorded in the Bible actually took place. And with the knowledge that the whole of the Christian faith is built on the legitimacy of the claims of the Easter story, it's unsurprising that the enemies of the gospel have targeted this particular doctrine in their attempts to discredit and undermine the Christian faith. As I always seem to have to concede at these big questions nights, this is a massive subject and it has been rumbling on probably since the resurrection itself. So we could spend a long time on this, but in the interest of managing our time, we'll be quite specific on the bits of the topic that we're going to explore this evening. So let me ask the first question. Where are the main criticisms directed when we come to look at the Easter story? Well, the first one is Scripture. And we can't really begin anywhere other than with the Bible on Big Questions nights, can we, when we look at what the Bible says about our given topic. But in this case, it is particularly relevant, because as we will no doubt all have seen this weekend when we've read the accounts of Resurrection Sunday across the four Gospels, we find that they are a little bit different. And we can, as many critics of the Christian faith have done over the years, become confused and uncertain as to the reliability of these records, given the range of detail that appears and what we are called to believe is a divinely inspired text that reveals salvation history to us. How many women went to the tomb? Did they go when it was dark, when it was daybreak, or very early in the morning? Where were the disciples when the women went back to tell them, and were they all together? These are some of the questions that are raised pretty legitimately, but there is no issue in them that cannot be reconciled when we take a couple of things into consideration. And rather than take up a lot of our time this evening going through all of these objections, I would instead like to direct you to a brilliant article that swats away all of these concerns on the Answers in Genesis website of all places. There's a link on your handout. There's a link that I've put, the same link obviously, that I've put on the screen. And I would encourage you to have a look when you're next online. I could read through it, I could go through all the kind of the pictures and stuff on it, but it would probably take most of our time, but I find it very compelling. And it really does deal with so many of these objections quite effortlessly. So if we can then assume that the gospel accounts are able to be reconciled and the documents themselves are trustworthy, then the discussion moves on to the content of the gospels and what they say about the death and resurrection of Jesus. Because in order for the Easter message to be trustworthy, we have to be able to show with some confidence three things. First, we have to be able to show that Jesus really died on the first day. Secondly, that Jesus' tomb was empty on the third day. And thirdly, that Jesus did appear to others after he was raised to life. Now, of course, we can turn to many texts that will plainly state that the Lord died, was raised, and that he appeared to his disciples, among others, and that he ascended back into heaven with the promise of a sure return. However, what we're looking for is the evidence behind those statements tonight, the detail that confirms the narrative. I once heard Peter Williams, the principal at Tyndale House and the author of the wonderful book Can We Trust the Gospels, speaking at a seminar about his previous job as a lecturer in New Testament at Aberdeen University. One of his responsibilities there was to make decisions on whether or not students would be granted extensions on deadlines depending on their mitigating circumstances. And he said that more often than not, it was the consistency in the seemingly innocuous details and the ability to recall those details that gave each student's plea the credibility required to be issued with the extended deadline. And Dr. Williams has applied that method to the study of the Gospels and found that they hold up remarkably well. So, for example, in John's account of the feeding of the 5,000, the fact that there is mention of grass on the ground for the people to sit on supports the authenticity of the passage, given the location and the time of year at Passover. The fact that the Lord speaks to Philip and asks about where they can buy food is consistent, given that Philip is from Bethsaida, from that region, and he would be the disciple with local knowledge. And there are a variety of similarly corroborating facts that he pulls together on many different sections of God's Word. So if we put this into practice then, beginning with the first of our questions, what do we find? Can we be really sure that Jesus was dead after the crucifixion? One school of thought on this is the so-called swoon theory, which suggests that the Lord was simply overcome with the pain and agony of the crucifixion, that he lost consciousness, and that once he was taken down from the cross and placed in the tomb, he came to, at which point he was able to stand up and leave. This is a theory proposed as far back ago as the 7th century, and we find evidence of it in the Quran. A more recent twist on it suggests that the error was a little more premeditated, and that the sponge that Jesus drank from consisted of a drug that brought on the appearance of death, which then enabled his followers to get him down and away before the effects wore off. But what does the Bible say? Well, we read in Matthew 27, verse 26, "Then he released Barabbas to them," as Pilate had released Barabbas to them, "but he had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified." We know that prior to the crucifixion, Jesus was arrested, that he endured a show trial and was flogged. And it's easy for us to overlook the severity of what these words actually mean. I apologize if the graphic description that is coming is a little bit much after your Easter Sunday lunch, but it is an important detail, because Roman flogging was brutal. By decree, it was supposed to last 39 lashes. But the reality was that the mood of the soldier delivering the blows was really what determined the number of strokes. The whip used was made of a braided leather that had pieces of metal incorporated in it to cause deep bruising of the flesh that would be further damaged by each subsequent lash. The same whip also had sharp pieces of bone woven into the braid as well, which would cut and slash at the victim's flesh. These strokes would strike the whole of the body from the shoulders down to the backs of the legs, and would leave the victim in an absolute mess. Eusebius, the 3rd century Greek historian, describes the outcome in stark terms. He writes, "The sufferer's veins were laid bare, and the very muscles, sinews, and bowels of the victim were open to exposure." Many people sentenced to die in the manner that Jesus was did not survive the flogging. Those who did would experience unbelievable pain, and they would invariably suffer from hypovolemic shock as a result of the loss of such a large volume of blood. And there are 4 symptoms of such shock. The heart races to try and pump blood that's no longer there. The blood pressure drops, causing the victim to faint or collapse. The kidneys stop producing urine to try and retain as much fluid in the body as possible. And the victim develops a raging thirst as the body craves more fluids to replace those lost through bleeding. Of these symptoms, 3 demonstrable ones are attested to in the gospel accounts. Matthew 27, verse 32, tells us that Simon the Cyrene was forced to carry Jesus' cross because he likely collapsed under the strain of trying to carry his crossbar in that state of shock. And in John 19, verse 28, we read of the Lord on the cross disclosing his thirst. The third we'll come to in a moment. But all of which is to say that even before a single nail was hammered in, Jesus was in a serious, perhaps even critical, clinical condition already. Then there's the cross itself. 5 to 7 inch long metal spikes were driven through the wrists and into the crossbar. According to the language of the 1st century Palestine, the wrists were a part of the hand. So when we find references to Thomas asking to touch the nail marks on the hands of the risen Christ, there is no contradiction. These nails then going in at the wrist would press on the medial nerve, causing yet more intense pain. And the same would happen on the feet. The weight of the victim's body would dislocate both shoulder joints, and every single breath would be an ordeal. The weight of the body pushed down on the diaphragm, and in order to breathe, the victim had to push themselves up onto their feet to ease the tension and allow a breath. The pain in the feet would be intense, the shredded flesh on the back scraping over the coarse timber of the cross with every breath, and eventually exhaustion would take over, and the victim would be unable to breathe. As the concentration of carbon dioxide in the blood increases, the acidity of the blood decreases, No, the pH decreases, the acidity increases. My chemistry teacher would be heartbroken to hear that. And an irregular heartbeat develops. Eventually, the heart fails and the victim dies. Now, do you remember the third demonstrable symptom of shock from blood loss that we were thinking of a minute ago? The sustained rapid heart rate results in a collection of fluid around the membranes in the heart and lungs. And John 19, verse 34 tells us of a soldier testing to see if Jesus was really dead. Instead, it says, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Given the organs that the spear would have had to penetrate to release this fluid, there is no doubt that even if the crucifixion itself hadn't yet killed Jesus, even if he had passed out with the pain, the death test certainly would have ended his life. Coupling these facts with the professionalism of the Roman soldiers in executing their victims and the threat of their own death, should anyone sentenced to death fail to actually die, means that there is a zero chance that he could have survived by accident. And even if the impossible had happened and he was transported to the tomb and the cold, damp environment of it revived him, he would be in no state to make public appearances within the next 2 days, certainly given the trauma to his body. It is also extremely unlikely that the pathetic and wretched figure that he would have cast would have inspired his followers to proclaim him the victor over death. Let's move on to the second question. Was the tomb really empty on the third day? The 4 gospel accounts say so, and unlike the mythological writings of later years, they do so with a stark simplicity. It draws no immediate theological conclusions. They simply report the events. And they do so in a time frame that meant that there would still have been eyewitnesses to those events who could contradict what was written if there was anything there that wasn't accurate. Eyewitnesses play a big role in the authenticity of the reports of the empty tomb, particularly the identity of the first visitors, that they were women. Women weren't regarded as trustworthy witnesses in the first century, so much so that they weren't allowed to give evidence in court, and there are even rabbinical sayings such as, "Let the words of the law be burned rather than delivered to women." They wouldn't cope very well today, I'm sure. But it's then remarkable that the primary witnesses to the empty tomb are these same female followers of Jesus. Any later legendary account of the discovery of the tomb would surely have portrayed male disciples as having been the ones to discover and adding weight and gravitas to the event in the process. All of this, of course, means that when the women are recorded as being first on the scene, the plausible explanation can only be that they were the first people to get there, indicating that the gospel writers faithfully recorded what happened, no matter how inconvenient, no matter how embarrassing, no matter how difficult to convince others those events happened to be. Of course, perhaps the best evidence of the empty tomb comes in the response from Jesus' enemies, the Jewish leaders, and their response that we find in Matthew 28 from verse 11. It says, "While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priests everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, 'You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble.' So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day." This episode begs the question, why would the Jews need to concoct such a story if the tomb wasn't empty? If they could turn round and point to the content still being there, then this becomes a non-event. The first century was a period of conflict between the Christians and Jews as they argued over the meaning of the absence of Jesus' body. Christian believers held that it meant that the Lord had been resurrected, whereas the Jews claimed that the disciples had stolen his body and made the whole thing up. An argument that falls down surely on 3 fronts. Firstly, because of the appointment of a guard to keep watch over the tomb was well attested and accepted by both sides, and surely their sole purpose was to prevent grave robbing. It seems ridiculous that even with that guard put in place, that they would be able to be circumvented by grave robbers. Secondly, how could the soldiers make any clear claim on what happened while they were asleep, since they were asleep? And thirdly, why would the disciples, emboldened in a quite extraordinary manner to carry the good news of Christ's death and resurrection, why would they willingly suffer and die for something that they knew to not be true? Why would they suffer and die for a lie? There can surely again be no doubt that just as Jesus was killed at the crucifixion, his tomb was genuinely empty on the morning of the third day. Of course, the authenticity of the resurrection of Jesus would be in trouble if there was any possibility that Jesus survived the cross or if his body was discovered in the tomb. But even though we cannot rule these out, that doesn't prove the resurrection narrative alone. For that to be acceptable, there has to be appearances, tangible appearances of the risen Lord after the resurrection. Once again, the Gospels contain accounts of appearances on the Emmaus Road, of events in the disciples' houses, or of a breakfast on a beach, narratives that confirm the solidity of Jesus' body and that he was eating. Two substantial claims to a genuine physical resurrection and the normal function of a human body. But what exists in the background that supports what we read here? Well, if we turn straight to what Christian academics believe to be the very best scriptural evidence of Jesus' post-resurrection appearances, we'll find it in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and reading from verse 3. It says this: "For what I received I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born." Why is this the best passage? Because this is a creed of the early Christian church, one of the earliest creeds of the early Christian church. How do we know this? Well, firstly, in the very first sentence of verse 3, we find those words, "received and passed on," which are technical terms to indicate that this is a holy tradition that is being shared. Secondly, its style and structure indicates that this is a creedal statement. And thirdly, there are terms that we don't find in Paul's writing language, signifying that there's use here of earlier terms that have been preserved, including the use of Aramaic, including the Aramaic name Cephas for Peter. So what kind of time frame are we talking about? Well, Paul tells us that he has already passed these words on to the Corinthian church, and so that means they must have predated his visit to Corinth in AD 51. That means that as a creed, this has been in use from within 20 years of the resurrection itself, which is really, really early. There are, of course, suggestions among scholars that it has been used for even longer than that, and that discussion of it was the subject of Paul's visit to James and Peter that he speaks about in Galatians 1 verse 18. The Greek word used to describe that visit is best translated as an investigative inquiry. What could he have been investigating? Could have been any number of things, but given that these same two apostles that he goes to visit are the ones who are named in this creed, then it's not too much of a leap of logic to suggest that he has sought them out specifically as eyewitnesses to what the Lord has affirmed to him verbally at Paul's conversion. If this is indeed the case, then that means that this creed has actually been used from within 6 years of the resurrection. I've been here 6 years. I can remember so many stories of things that have happened in this church in the last 6 years. If people are writing down the evidence of the Lord's resurrection and his appearance to other people, to disciples, to 500 people, then you have to take that seriously. Even if it isn't as early as that, and even if it is within that 20 years that we thought about earlier, this is still an extremely early statement. And again, involves people who are still alive, who are still around, who are still listening to these words, and who can put their hand up and say, that's not true if it's spurious, or can say, yes, I saw that, and add veracity to the claim. As I have said, this is an enormous topic, and we have barely scratched the surface of it this evening. However, I hope that we have enough here to get some conversation and discussion going, and that we all may end our Easter Sunday with yet greater confidence in the truth at its pinnacle of the greatest story ever told. Carrying on in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, I just want to finish with those immortal words of the apostle. "But if it is preached that Christ has been raised from the dead, how can some of you say that there is no resurrection of the dead? If there is no resurrection of the dead, then not even Christ has been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. This is a serious subject. We need to have confidence in it. We need to be able to defend it when questioned or when criticized. So let's spend some time with the discussion questions that are on your tables, and I'm going to put them up on the screen, and let's have a chat about what we've just been thinking about. Sorry to interrupt, just want to share a couple of resources with you before we sing our last song, and then we'll close in prayer, and you can carry on your conversations if you want to, or you can get home, or whatever it happens to be. I've got a pile of dishes to do, so I'll be going at some point. So as was the case with most of these evenings, I tend to lean heavily on one text and then kind of fill in with bits and bobs from others. The case for Easter is the one that I've been relying on most heavily for the stuff we've done tonight, by Lee Strobel. It's about 90 to 100 pages, quite a thin book. It's a half-hour read, depending on your reading speed. I saw that they had it in the Faith Mission bookshop when I was in the other day for $3.99, but you can get it online, and the Kindle version on Amazon is only 50 pence. So if you're an electronic book user, it's not too expensive. Another book I've been using is Risen Indeed by Gary Habermas. He is one of the big movers and shakers in this area of research. It's quite academic, this one, and very historical rather than kind of focusing specifically on the scriptural input on the death and resurrection of Jesus. It's maybe worth a look, but it's much heavier and much thicker and much more expensive, as you can see there as well. But I'll put the case for Easter on the library bookshelf out there, but the Risen Indeed that I have is electronic, so, well, I'm afraid, unless you borrow my iPad, you can't, and you can't. So, yeah, and added to that, also don't forget the Answers in Genesis article, which kind of harmonizes the four gospel accounts of that resurrection Sunday morning, which is really well worth a read.